The Cold War was a disagreement around 1945 between the United States and the Soviet Union. Their goal was to dominate foreign policy and have their ideas of either capitalism or communism accepted. On March 12, 1947, Harry Truman announced details to Congress about a plan he had come up with. This plan of action eventually became known as the Truman Doctrine. It talked about providing political, military, and economic assistance to all democratic nations. That is, if they were under threat of becoming communistic. Truman asked for $400 million from the government. He explained that he intended to send American military to the countries of need. Truman had a feeling that if one country fell to communism, another would fall as well. This theory became known as the Domino Theory. The government believed Truman's thoughts and ideas and approved his request. His plan was put into action when aid to Turkey and Greece was sent. The Marshall Plan was the primary plan of the United States for rebuilding and creating a stronger foundation for the countries of Western Europe. This plan was also meant to repel communism after World War II. The plan was made by Secretary of State George Marshall. It was in operation for 4 years beginning in July 1947. It is logical, said Marshall, that the United States should do whatever it is able to do to assist in returning to normal economic health to the world. He believed without our help there could be no political stability and no assured peace. The Marshall Plan was the key help to importing goods. There is no clear consensus on the exact amount spent. Still, it made a big difference. The plan ended in 1951. Various other forms of American aid to Europe continued afterwards. George Marshall was a wise man. On the week of March 12, 1949, history was made. In just 7 days, 45,683 tons of supplies were flown into Berlin. The Berlin airlift was one of the first international crises of the Cold War. It started when the Soviet Union blocked the three Western powers' railroads and street access to the western sections of Berlin. In response, the Western Allies formed the Berlin airlift to supply the city with food. If the supplies could not be flown in fast enough, Soviet would eventually be needed in order to prevent starvation. By the spring of 1949, the effort was clearly succeeding. The success of the airlift was humiliating to the Soviets, who had repeatedly claimed it could never work. The Berlin airlift saved many people and soldiers from dying in Germany. The Korean War was a period of military conflict between North Korea and South Korea. The war started on June 25, 1950. It stopped when an armistice was signed on July 27, 1953. The conflict arose from the attempts of the two Korean powers to reunite Korea under their government. These negotiations ended when the North Korean army invaded the South on June 25, 1950. The United Nations allied with the United States, who intervened on behalf of South Korea. For those who don't know, the United Nations were founded in 1945 and were an international organization whose aims were to mainly stop wars between countries. After the U.S. and the UN made rapid advancements in the South Korean counterattack, Communist allies Chinese forces intervened on behalf of North Korea, shifting the balances of war and ultimately leading to an armistice that restored the original boundaries between North and South Korea. Until 1961, East Germany citizens were allowed to travel to West Germany. This all changed in 1961. The Berlin Wall was put up between the two borders. This was because more than 2.6 million East Germans escaped to West Germany from 1949 to 1961. The life in West Germany was much better than in the East, mainly because West Germany got financial help through the Marshall Plan from the USA. In East Germany, a communist system was established and many people had to suffer under repressions of the Communist Party. During this period, at least 136 people were confirmed killed trying to cross the wall into West Berlin. In 1991, the Eastern government gave in and tore the wall down. Many people confuse the Berlin Wall with the Iron Curtain. The Iron Curtain was a barrier established between the Soviet bloc and Western Europe from 1945 to 1990.
The Cuban Missile Crisis was the closest the world had ever come to a nuclear war. It started over the arms race. Russia decided to put missiles in Cuba. This made the United States worried, so they threatened to attack Cuba. The crisis happened during the Cold War, increasing the problem of the war. The war was luckily diverted by two men. The men were JFK and Premier Nikita Khrushchev. These decisions saved the planet from catastrophe. Those are some facts about the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Around midnight, several thousands of Czechoslovakia citizens awoke to the sound of heavy iron colossuses. People began to panic and they ran out on the streets, only to be approached by heavy armed vehicles and tanks. Nobody knew what was going on, except for a few officers of the Soviet Union and members of its Warsaw Pact allies invaded the country to halt the reforms. The Warsaw Pact was an organization of communist states in Central and Eastern Europe. The Communist Party of Czechoslovakia was forced to suppress all moves made towards democracy. In 1968, the Soviet pulled their troops out of Czechoslovakia. This event was known as Prague Spring.
The Strategic Arms Limitation talks began in 1972. The talks were over two documents, the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty and the Intim Agreement. Both agreements were signed in May 26, 1972. They were over freezing the number of strategic ballistic missiles that could be fired. The ICBM silos were prohibited, but S.A.L.T launchers could be increased. Missiles were allowed, but only in specific areas and having to notify other nations. If any nuclear missiles were fired, the country would be attacked. The Strategic Arms Limitation can also be known as S.A.L.T. Those are some facts about the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty. Richard M. Nixon declared in 1969 that he would continue the American involvement with the Vietnam War. He wanted to end the conflict and secure peace with honor for the United States and for his ally, South Vietnam. Richard Nixon had many peace talks with North Vietnam to try to end the fighting. Despite the talks in March 1972, North Vietnam attempted to bypass the negotiations altogether with a full-scale invasion of the South. On October 11th, there were peace agreements made. One agreement stated that there would be no firing after 24 hours. This gave the Americans what they wanted and the North Vietnamese what they wanted. South Vietnam didn't agree with the treaty, and that made the North mad. This then ended the talks altogether. Finally, in January 1973, everyone had an agreement they could agree on. This then made the agreement final. There we go. Hopefully. NATO was an alliance of 16 sovereign Euro-Atlantic countries. They were dedicated to maintaining domestic freedom. The arms race can also be called proliferation because they both have to do with a rapid increase in nuclear weapons. When Cuba had its missiles pointed towards America, both sides were willing to push it to a Brinkmanship by making an already dangerous situation even more dangerous.
The Entente is a primary term used in reference to the general reduction in tension between the Soviet Union and the United States and a thawing of the Cold War.